Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, everybody. Thank you for either tuning in tonight or coming tonight. I'm Gwen Robinson, President of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, and I'm here to introduce this program and help launch this very valuable report. As you know, we're here tonight to hear about a very timely study into human trafficking in Asia and an assessment of what is being done and what is not being done, and how countries and organisations can up the game to counter human trafficking, particularly in this region. The sobering finding, I'm afraid to say, of the report is that the international effort to counter this trade is losing, and estimates continue to rise to more than 40 million people at this point who've been trafficked as modern-day slaves today, more than at any other time in history. Covid-19 has only exacerbated this situation, hitting the economy and jobs and making people more vulnerable to trafficking and more desperate to escape their circumstances. In Asia, this situation is particularly acute, particularly in countries like Myanmar, although there are other crises going on there, and other struggling economies. So tonight, to present findings of the study, I'd like to introduce Matt Friedman, who's here. Yes, Matt Friedman, who is joining us from Hong Kong?
Yes.
From Hong Kong. He's a leading human trafficking expert and main author of this report, and he's CEO of the Mekong Club, a civil society organisation based in Hong Kong that works with corporations to help them clean their supply chains to make sure their operations are trafficking free. He's also former head of a UN interagency project on human trafficking and a former trafficking expert at USAID. I'm also introducing a very valued club member, Steve Golster, head of Freeland, which specialises in counter-trafficking efforts, and next to him on the far right is Deputy Director Ricardo Forrester, who are both co-authors of the report along with Matt. As partners, these two organisations have created ACET, the Analytical Centre of Excellence on Trafficking, a cyber hub of NGOs that pool data to help the anti-trafficking effort. So with that introduction, I'm going to first hand over to Steve, I think, who will take it on from there. So thank you all for coming and listening. And if I may just remind, next week we are having a night on Myanmar to discuss the escalating crisis on Myanmar with a bit of a spotlight on the future of media and information out of Myanmar, which I think is one of the critical elements that are helping the world really see what's going on there. So watch for details on that. That'll be on March the 11th. Back to human trafficking, so another happy subject.
Yeah.
Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Gwen. Thanks very much. And as Gwen said, I'm head of Freeland, but also a proud board member of the FCCT here. Thanks for taking time out. We know there's an awful lot going on in this country, in this region, with COVID and the situation in Myanmar. And in fact, it's what prompted us to do a new study, because the political and economic disruption from these and other events is definitely impacting trafficking. And even before that, we were looking at the situation, and we know from working on the front line, supporting law enforcement, working with some of the victim support organizations, that the situation is still, it's bad. And we hate to admit it, but we feel that the counter-trafficking and persons community is not winning this battle yet. So we tried to, scratch our heads to figure out how can we do better. And similar to, we also work on counter-wildlife trafficking and counter-transnational organized crime in general. And similar to some reports and studies we did on that, we're not really an organization that does lots of studies. We like to do more action-oriented, but we've come to appreciate the value of data and how good analyzed data can help streamline good enforcement, behavior change efforts, and development programs. So we have been crunching our data under the Analytical Center of Excellence on Trafficking, something we set up, as Gwen said, with partners, including Mekong. I've had support from PMI Impact Fund, also from IBM and Celebrite, digital intelligence companies that have provided us with tools for free that help us really speed up the game on open source information analysis, which has been very, very useful. So with that, we decided to do an update report on what's going on with human trafficking, and more importantly, what's going on with the counter-trafficking response. And we couldn't think of anybody better than our own partner, Matt Friedman, who's really one of the world's experts on this, years of experience to lead the effort. He's the lead author on this. And so we'd like to hear from Matt now, run us through the study here, and after that, we'll open it up for some discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I'd like to also thank Freeland and FCC Thailand. As Steve indicated, I've been working on this issue for a long time, 35 years. In fact, I was working on it before human trafficking even had a name. So what I'll be talking about is counter-trafficking in Asia, and just look at some of the trends, some of the things that we're seeing, some of the deficiencies, and offer some suggestions on what we can do in order to make it better. Now, most of us have seen these types of pictures, you know, the girl in prostitution, the fishing boat in Thailand, the sweatshops, the brick kilns in China and different parts of Southeast Asia, Sumit Sakan, the factory there, and rubber gloves. We're used to kind of seeing a certain type of trafficking pictures because the light has shined on those particular areas. But what we're beginning to see is as the light moves to other locations, other sectors are beginning to step up and say we need to address human trafficking. For example, the tech sector. Facebook is interested in this topic because a certain percentage of people are recruited from their platform into forced labor. Airbnb is interested in this because a certain number of people are using their rooms for pop-up brothels. I recently met with a pharmaceutical company who said that the distribution system, the third-party drivers they found were being exploited. Here during the COVID period, we're seeing food delivery people being basically trafficked. And so the point is that when people can take advantage of other people, they do it. And if they can get away with it and nobody's going to stop it, it's going to continue and it's going to expand. To put the numbers into perspective, it's estimated that there are over 40 million people in modern slavery. About 25 million of them are in forced labor. 16 million of them would be associated with the private sector, where we get our clothes and our food and our electronics and so forth. About 62% of what is called modern slavery is here in Asia, basically for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's a lot of people in Asia. China, 1.4 billion, India, 1.3 billion. Then you have Pakistan and Bangladesh and Japan and Indonesia. All of those countries have amazing population sizes. In addition to that, you have a situation where many of these countries have had feudal systems in place that even in 2021 haven't been completely dismantled. And I dare say that you see that all over the world. When it comes to the rate of human trafficking, about 9.2 million people enter per year. That translates to about 25,200 per day. In the time it takes us to do this presentation, about 1,000 slaves around the world. And at the that means that it comes down to about a slave every 4 seconds. So we're talking about a lot of people that are in this kind of a situation. Now, with all of the NGOs and the governments and the private sector and the United Nations organizations collectively, last year the world helped about 108,000 people out of modern slavery. That's 0.2% of the victims. Out of an estimated 500,000 criminals, about 7,000 were convicted, according to the global standard. That's about 0.8%. Now, when you see these numbers, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are they not doing their job? Are they lazy? That's really not the issue. The issue is this. The profits generated from modern slavery are 150 billion US dollars. Look at all the zeros there. The amount of money that's used to address it is about 350 million globally, or 0.23% of the profits. To put this into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, $6 billion worth. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the amount of money that's used globally to address modern slavery. You can see what it is we're up against. In addition to that, the number of kind of do-gooder types, people like myself who work and do this full time, is about 20,000 people around the world, up against the 500,000 greed incentivized criminals who don't have to follow rules. We do. Whenever we change our protocol or approach, we have to get donor support. You can see what we're up against. And lastly, when it comes to awareness, most people have heard of human trafficking or modern slavery, but at the end of the day, they don't really have much in the way of a clear understanding of it. And that's partly because we, the counter-trafficking world, haven't done a good enough job to help educate and inform people about what they need to know in order to address modern slavery. So as a result of what I just said, with the huge profits that are generated and the amount of money that is available and the fact that we're only helping about 0.2%, I think it's fair to say the fight against human trafficking is not being won. In fact, I sometimes feel like we're not even in the race. When it comes to the challenges that we face related to kind of the COVID period, we see factories all over Asia that are closing down. And remember, these people are used to having a paycheck. They go from paycheck to survive. So when the factory closed down and when they go home because of quarantine or no work, they eventually very quickly go through their savings. And as a result of that, no work, no money, there's debt. And debt is probably one of the biggest ingredients when it comes to basically allowing a person to get trafficked, because when the debt collector comes and says, I need you to pay something, and there's no money from anywhere, they'll take a family member or two and say that they have to come with me for a period of time to pay the debt back. So this form of desperation that we're seeing will probably exacerbate the situation. And I personally feel that we'll go from 40 million to maybe even as much as 60 million, because we're seeing desperation all over Asia. When it comes to the World Bank, they say that up to 500 million people will enter back into poverty. It took us 20 years to get them out of that. Now they're going back in again. And we've seen situations in Bangladesh where people will go to a factory and say, I'll work for free if you give me room and board because I have no place else to go and I need to eat. When it comes to Myanmar, this is a political disaster that we're facing now. We also see natural disasters and health disasters that kind of wreak havoc on human trafficking. If this continues long enough, if it becomes a kind of a civil type of response where there are militias and military going after people, people will leave Myanmar. And obviously, when they go to another country, the possibility of them entering in the pool of migration, which is already filled, will result in a certain amount of exploitation taking place. We often hear that traffickers fish in the pool of migration, and that will certainly be the case. Protective systems break down. In a community, you usually have people who kind of watch out for each other, family members, neighbors, friends. When there's this disruption, a lot of people are displaced, they're not in the same locations, and as a result of that, the possibility of traffickers coming in and taking advantage of that certainly is a possibility. Business closures. When there is a serious situation like this, where communication stops, when uncertainty exists, orders stop. And as a result of that, the same issue I talked about for COVID could certainly happen in Myanmar as well, as workers find themselves in a situation where they just don't have a job. And lastly, law and order problems. So let's say there's a trafficking situation that's unfolding. Who do you go to if basically the law enforcement is at odds with the population, which is often the case in kind of a situation we're seeing unfold in Myanmar. So expect to see these issues arise if people from Myanmar are disenfranchised for a long enough time and they start fleeing. The same types of things we saw over the last 30 years in that country. Different circumstances, but the same potential outcome can happen. So when it comes to the issues that we talk about in the report, kind of one of the biggest issues that we often face is a misinformation or a lack of awareness. Now, all across Asia, you have migrants who went from one place to another. They were trafficked. When they get home, they don't go and say, oh, by the way, I was tricked and deceived and forced into this situation, and I didn't get anything and I was trafficked. Many migrants lie about their experience. Why? Because they don't want to lose face. Another thing that we often see is the information that is presented to communities is so varied that it's confusing, and a lot of people really don't understand what is the message that they're supposed to take. When it comes to corruption as an issue, when you're talking about $150 billion generated, there's a lot of discretionary cash that can be used to basically pay people off. We also know that when it comes to sex trafficking, there's often been kind of a relationship between prostitution and law enforcement. This goes back generations. Sometimes law enforcement's involved and will do something, sometimes they won't, sometimes there are kickbacks, there are various other things. And when it comes to supply chains, which is what we're seeing and hearing a lot about, we find that auditors can get paid off. And it's pretty easy for companies to basically pay somebody off. In fact, I had one brand that had an auditor go in, didn't accept the bribe, and they were kidnapped. And then they basically contacted the brand and said, we're not going to let this person go unless you promise to make sure that you don't terminate our orders. You can imagine what kind of a situation that was. Research and data collection. For years, donors were saying, you know, we don't have time for research. It's too time consuming. Let's just focus on helping the people. And that's a very laudable, legitimate approach. But if you don't have data, you don't have kind of intelligence to know whether you're doing the right thing. And when it comes to data collection, oftentimes there was qualitative research, but not quantitative research. When I was working for the United Nations, we got experts from all over the world who focused on human trafficking. And out of the 30 people, 27 of them were quant researchers, and only 3 of them were qualitative. And only 3 of them were quant researchers. When it comes to collaboration, you have a lot of organizations, NGOs, that find it hard to work with other organizations. Sometimes it's because of jealousy. They're afraid that if they work with another organization, it'll give them a competitive edge to get money. Sometimes it's just a matter of collaboration hasn't been done, so it feels like it's a waste of time. Sometimes it's just a poor use of kind of the collaborative time that people have, and just through attrition, they eventually just drop out. But with a lack of collaboration, all of the potential synergistic effects of bringing people together are lost. When it comes to the private sector, a lot of people wag their finger at the private sector and say the private sector is inherently evil, and they would use slavery in order to have shareholder profits. I used to kind of bias in that particular direction when I was working for the public sector, but I've been working with them for the last 10 years. And any responsible company sees any kind of exploitation in their network or in their supply chain as a real risk, and they will do everything they can to address it. But if you kind of go after them and name and shame them without offering them an opportunity to fix things before they kind of move forward, basically you close that door. And lastly, when it comes to the counter-trafficking world, we haven't had a plan of action that is collectively accepted by kind of the counter-trafficking community. In the HIV/AIDS community, there's a plan that goes from 30,000 feet down to the community level. We see it in tuberculosis control, education, poverty alleviation, even disaster mitigation, but the plan for modern slavery has never existed. So when it comes to addressing some of these things, one of the first things that can be done to address the info and awareness is to find a way of standardizing awareness raising. Now, about 8 years ago, you had MTV Exit. It was a campaign that focused on prevention that brought many of the prevention and awareness raising organizations together collectively under a single umbrella. And what they did is they developed certain materials that would relate to the different populations. They would have materials related to the government, to the private sector, and to migrants. And this would be done in the local language, and it would be done in such a way that market research was used to ensure that the message was correct. And as a result of that, we had a campaign that had a common goal and direction. We need something like that in place. When it comes to corruption, I worked in Nepal for years, and during the time that I was there, we tried to fix corruption, and we came to realize it wasn't possible. You had a police officer who made about $30 a month. They needed 60 to live on, so they had to be corrupt in some way. And so what we would do is we would work with the local NGOs to find individuals within the system who, for whatever reason, had a heart for addressing modern slavery. And so this could be a prosecutor or a judge. So when a case was launched at the district level, immediately after filing it, a call would be made to a prosecutor in Kathmandu, and then 5 minutes later, that district would be told, we're moving this case to Kathmandu to ensure that a bribe wasn't offered so that the case would be dropped. Using those types of positive systems and procedures can be a very effective way of addressing modern slavery. When it comes to information, technology can be used to collect information. For example, the organization that I work with has an app called Apprise, and the way the app works is you have a phone that has flags on the front of it. You go up to a potential migrant where you don't know where they come from and get them to press the flag on the front of the phone. And then with headphones on, in that person's language, it will say, we're going to ask you some questions. And if the answer to the question is yes, press green, no, press red. Are you in an exploitative situation? Are you indebted? Do you need help? Based on how they answer the questions, you can determine whether or not that person needs help. That potential triage at that moment is an essential part of identifying victims. We also work with a blockchain company. So the blockchain company works with recruitment agencies and the people being recruited. They blockchain the information, which means that it's immutable, it can't be changed, and it will stay with that person so that when they get to the destination site, they basically are assured to get what it is they are told they're going to get, because if anybody asks, they have the evidence for that. Another thing that we're seeing is that there's organizations like the Traffic Analysis Hub. This happens to be in the UK, but they address data collection issues all over the world. They collect information about cases, about case situations, and what they do with that information is analyze it and then visualize it using highly sophisticated software that allows us to see patterns. It gives us the intelligence we need in order to identify what to do based on hotspots and where we're seeing kind of a convergence of trafficking taking place. We are seeing donor programs, and we talk about this in the report, that are moving in the direction of, instead of just having one or two NGOs, basically supporting a packaged approach. So if they are addressing protection, which is what happens after a person leaves a harmful situation, which usually includes a raid and rescue, a shelter visit, a trip to the community to get them settled, maybe some vocational training and some vocational placement. Those traditionally are independent organizations. By having a funding agent fund all of them collectively, it results in a packaging of this so that there's a seamless tracking of a person through this system. This type of creative way of using donor assistance has been tried all over Southeast Asia and has worked quite effectively. In fact, Freeland has done this with their law enforcement approach, where they basically will ensure that if a raid and rescue is taking place, they're talking to the police, they're talking to the shelter people, they're talking to the prosecutors, they're talking to all the people that have to be involved in the process to ensure that basically the case moves forward. The organization I work with, the Mekong Club, works with the private sector in a positive, supportive way. We have an association. The association is made up of about 50 different organizations, mostly Fortune 500 companies that meet on a quarterly basis. And we divide this group into 4 categories: finance, manufacturing, retail, hospitality. When these groups come together, they debate and discuss, and they say, we need training, we need apps, we need analysis. As a result of this process, we not only create awareness with this group, but at the same time, we give them the tools and the means to find modern slavery and to address it. And as a result of them doing it themselves, it's a very cost-effective way to reduce modern slavery. And in fact, across Asia, with groups similar to ours, we're seeing a significant reduction in modern slavery circumstances because they're aware of what they need to do in order to address it. Kind of a collective blueprint is needed. And so, I've been talking about this for 25 years. And So we eventually did something about it for the private sector. Working with a number of different organizations, we've developed what's called the Moon Goal program that looks at the private sector response to addressing modern slavery. This particular paper will be launched on March 16th. But what it does is it makes a case for the fact that there are certain things that, if done collectively, will result in basically a significant reduction in modern slavery. Standardized data collection and analysis, getting the various stakeholders together, identifying unified tools, reporting when you find cases, and having a system and procedure to be able to address that, and getting the NGOs and the legal sector and everybody to work together. So having this planning document really does make a difference. It gives a sense of what the targets and the approaches can and should be. We also talk about a victim-centered approach. And for anyone who doesn't know what this means, it's exactly what it says. The victim is at the center of everything. After they are rescued, you focus on the victim. You focus on their needs, what their requirements are, how they move from one place to another. You make sure that they don't find themselves in a situation of being re-trafficked. And so the report talks about the various steps that can and should be done. And lastly, evaluation. You know, the thing about the human rights sector and human trafficking as well is a lot of organizations don't want to be evaluated. I've heard this over and over again where people say, well, wait a minute, are you saying that I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Are you questioning whether or not I'm doing the right thing? And as a result of that, there is kind of not nearly the evaluation information we need. And to give kind of an example of the importance of this, you know, we, for example, in northern Thailand, we're funding organizations to keep girls in school for an extended period of time. And for years, this was a regular part of the process. And the basic assumption is if they're in school, they're not going to get trafficked. When that program was evaluated, they identified that in many cases, there were increases in human trafficking. Why? Because the assumption was my daughter is better educated. I can send her down to the city to get a job. She can't compete with the better networked urban people. She can't go home. She'll lose face. And so as a result of that, trafficking increases. Girls' education is great. It's important. But you have to build in a protective awareness raising campaign to ensure that they don't get trafficked afterwards. So evaluation helps with that. So these are just some of the examples of the types of things that are included in the report. I'm just going to end with a story. So years ago, I lived in Nepal for 8 years. I desperately wanted to do something to address modern slavery. So I decided I was going to write a book. As part of this book process, I went from shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Geeta. And every time I approached, she said, no, I don't want to talk to you. But she sat and listened to all the other interviews. When I finished and I was leaving, Geeta comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. I was thrilled. She sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of a table. In over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I had ever heard of rape and torture and betrayal. Everything that I had heard times 10. Honestly, didn't know what to say to this girl. Finally, I turned to her and I said, wow, Geeta, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrific things they did to you. She paused and paused and paused. And then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? Said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help her. Nobody came. She said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything around her was right out in the open. It was blatantly, right there for anybody to find. Nobody did anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a 15-year-old girl to have been commercially raped 7,000 times only to get AIDS and eventually die. Now, I tell this story because I told you the number of people that we're able to influence in helping, 0.2%. In order for us to really make a difference, it can't just be the NGOs and the governments and the UN. It has to be the private sector, the faith-based groups, the students and the general public. We have to draw a line in the sand and say enough is enough. This has to change. We all have to take a kind of a piece of responsibility for this and do what we can to help stop this. Because if short of that, we're going to be at around 1%. That's unacceptable. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, for that excellent overview. Uh, Surely we can do better, and I think you pointed that out very well, and the report reflects that. And thanks not only for telling us about the current situation, but projecting also where things are going if we don't do a better job, and also for the specific recommendations which are found in this report. You can dig deeper there. I especially like you pointing out that we don't have a common plan and that we need it, and we can certainly create one, but we need to recognize we don't have one, the community. I want to just add and emphasize a couple points. We're going to open up to comments and questions from the audience, both watching this on Facebook Live and who are here. One point I just wanted to add and emphasize was how we're finding that a lot of trafficking starts out as illegal immigration. There's a lot of people that, as you said, are very desperate. They willingly sign up with something knowing that they are going to defraud visa authorities, border patrol police, etc. And a lot of times, they get caught and arrested, or don't get caught, but they're feeling quite guilty and actually are perceived as criminals. But in fact, at some point along the supply chain, after they have agreed to pay people off and go into debt bondage, they are essentially human trafficking victims. We see that a lot of Thais leaving Thailand for other countries, signing up thinking they're going to make a lot of money somewhere else and ending up in the United States or Europe or elsewhere in massage parlors and not making any money at all and doing things that they weren't expecting, at least not in that situation. And we're finding it with folks coming from Myanmar to Thailand and all sorts of different directions. So that illegal immigration that blends into trafficking is something that I think our community and law enforcement really need to work on together. I also want to just ask Ricardo here, who helped out with the research and ongoing analysis on this, if he wants to add anything before we open it up to the floor.
Sure, just a couple of quick points. My background is in theoretical criminology, and when I started looking at the issue of human trafficking, I realized that all the research available to me was mostly victim-centric. So I decided to study criminal subculture, namely the Colombian cartels who would bring the victims of human trafficking over to Hong Kong. And when I was doing my literature review, I realized that the amount of academic research conducted on traffickers was limited mostly to studies conducted in the 1960s and 70s, published in the States on pimping, which is a completely different dynamic to human trafficking. So as Matt said rightly, we need to start focusing research efforts on the academic side on traffickers and not solely focus on the victims and such, and understand the background of the traffickers. Like to reference one of the cases which we worked, the Rohingya case, Steve, we found that a lot of the victims of human trafficking became the traffickers because they'd go back to their communities, they would have lost years of their lives, and they'd have no other way to be able to recoup the time and such. And they'd already had attained trust within their communities to the point where they would be able to recruit further victims of human trafficking. Another point to reiterate, on the theoretical criminological side, as Matt said, there's outside of there being a lot of money in the field of human trafficking. Like if I was a career criminal, I would partake in human trafficking. It's one of the biggest crimes of opportunity. I mean, what's my deterrent? There is no deterrent. It's a multi-jurisdictional crime. Do cops, let's say in the case of the Colombian cartels, which bring a girl over from a victim from Colombia through to France and then to Hong Kong, the crime occurs in multiple jurisdictions. Do the police in Hong Kong contact the police in France, who in turn contact the police in Colombia to be able to build up the chain of criminality? No, they don't work together. It's too much work, and most often than not, there's not enough political will to do so. So what happens? What happens on the prosecution side is a human trafficker, although the global legislation is good, gets done on local predicate offenses, which means that they do not get the full penalty. And if you would assume that these individuals make about $4,000 per victim per day, if they were to be incarcerated on a predicate charge, that removes the whole ability of deterrence to work. I mean, if you look at it in the terms of rationality, if you're able to make $4,000 per victim per day, and then you get a couple of years, would you not do that? if you're a career criminal. And the same applies to many different types of crime. As Steve said, we also work in wildlife trafficking. Again, as a career criminal, would you not be involved in wildlife trafficking? You can choose where to push a consignment of parts through, as there's no homogenized legislation in ASEAN. We can choose where to be caught. So let's say that in certain countries there is no jail time for wildlife trafficking. You pay a fine. So let's say I send 100 shipments of rhino horn. Maybe 90 of them get caught. I can afford the next 100 fines on getting 3 or 4 consignments through. So again, the biggest problem is deterrent, as there is no deterrence to be able to, inhibit a career criminal to be able to partake in this type of crime. And these are points which we raise in the report, which I've spoken to Matt a lot about, as we both have different experiences in the field. Ours, as Steve said, are more frontline, and Matt's are more involved with the private sector, slavery footprints within civil society and corporations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Yeah, well, we'll open it up and just, we've heard a lot of heavy information here. We actually do have some concrete success stories, which we'd love to see expanded. We do know what success looks like. I'm sure some people here do as well. But just to reiterate that point, the thing we're astounded by in doing the analysis on human trafficking is how profitable it is. Not just the numbers you put up there, Matt, which are astounding, but there's no overheads here. Overhead costs are pushed onto the victim. They have to work for their food, whether they're on the fishing boat or sex trafficking, whatever. There's no overheads. So let's open this up to our folks on Facebook and here. If there's anybody who's got any comments or questions, the floor is open. Please. Would you mind, I'm sorry, I should have pointed out, we have a microphone, and that will also allow people, sorry, put you on the spot there, but I'm sure it's a good question, and we'd all like to hear it. And if you could, tell us who you are. If you want to keep that secret, we'll respect that too.
My first name. My name is Parveen. I was just curious about, I read something about you guys partnering with IBM and using their analytical tools to further your research and analysis. So I just wonder if you can elaborate a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, IBM and the company Celebrite have both given us digital intelligence tools, which we use ourselves, but we also use in training courses and try to the degree we can, gift them to enforcement agencies who we think have trustworthy, capable hands. So specifically, the tools from IBM are Analyst Notebook, I2. And we're not law enforcement agencies, so we're just mining the open source information out there. And it's just an incredible amount of good, valuable data. There's also an incredible amount of crap data out there. So you still have to have expertise coupled with this technology to look out there onto the internet, everything from travel platforms to shipping cargo tracking platforms to all kinds of things in between. If you know what you're looking for, you can do that. Plus, these tools are very helpful between IBM and Celebrite to help law enforcement agencies extract and analyze data that might be taken from phones or computers after a bust. So the Rohingya example that Ricardo gave before, we helped on a case where Thai police stopped a truck some years back, which had a whole bunch of people stuffed in the back. It was at the dead of night, and they figured they were Rohingya. They were on their way down towards southern Thailand. Called us, and they said, "You told us, give us a call next time we caught some people with their telephones." Truck driver had a telephone. Normally, in a case like that, they would have sent the victims back to the border, sent them back, deported them at some point, and arrested the courier, essentially. In this case, long story short, they were able to extract and analyze the data with some technology that we helped them with and some training, and they found out who was who in the zoo and figured out who the truck driver was talking to, and that led all the way up to an Army Major General at some point, and he was eventually prosecuted. That was a landmark case here in Thailand. So technology definitely helps.
I'd like to add to that, Steve.
Yeah, please.
Just a practical case. I had one of my partners came and said that they have a domestic helper who is falling in love with somebody in the UK, and there are all kinds of red flags. The guy said he was a certain age and he looked to be a lot older and so forth. And so we use this technology to just look at kind of publicly available information. It does a deep dive into everything related to the person you put in there. We were able to identify that this guy had 3 Facebook accounts. He said he went to Oxford. He basically said he's 26 in one, he's 58 in another. He works at McDonald's. He was a massage therapist. He had association with prostitution and some of the readout. And so it gives you a really detailed description of kind of what it is that this person has done over time. And this certainly influenced this woman when it came to whether that relationship should continue. It didn't, which was a good thing, but it demonstrates the kind of utility of this type of software.
And I know we've had a question come through on Facebook as well, which is people are asking, what do we need here in Thailand, if from volunteers or whatever. I think there's lots of different things that are needed, but one is data. We need data. We need to mine the open sources, eyes and ears, but also just time providing data. We've got the tools to crunch it. Secondly, we would encourage you to look into some of the victim support centers. We do not do that, but there's some really good ones here in Thailand. They are all under-resourced, and in our experience, victims like to have a choice between the government facilities and private facilities. So, other comments or questions out there? Yes, Ben.
Yeah, Ben Davis. My question is, given the extraordinary profits that you're talking about, how are the funds moved from one operation from one bit of the cartel to the other, and what can be done to basically hit that, because transfer of cash should be traceable? Thank you.
I'm happy to answer that one, or start to answer that. We work with about 20 different banks, and the banks are really concerned about this issue because the $150 billion, if any of that gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering and they get fined. So what the banks start to do is to do a typology, which basically breaks the criminal activity into component parts so that you can basically kind of see the various transactions that take place along the way. And then based on those transactions, they identify which of the transactions would be nefarious or what would be called red flags. And then what they do is they're able to run those red flags across big business. So to give a very concrete example, there was a nail salon chain in northern part of the United States. And it was run by Vietnamese people. And it had hours from 9 in the morning until 9 o'clock at night. But what they were finding were transactions taking place at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, all around $200. When they looked into it, they came to realize there was a sex trafficking ring in the same business. So in this particular case, the red flag is transactions after hours of a certain amount of money. If you run that, you might find other locations that have something similar. At the end of the day, what we're talking about here is greed. People want to make money. So if you go after the money, that's really where you're going to be able to make a difference. Another thing is there hasn't been enough emphasis on using civil remedies. So maybe you can't get somebody to get through an entire kind of legal criminal court case because of all kinds of issues and problems. But if you're able to make a civil case and basically just even accuse that individual of using money that came from criminal activities, their accounts can be frozen in different locations. And as a result of that, you can go after the things. There are certain criminals who don't mind going to jail for a couple of days or a couple of months or a couple of years, but you go after their stuff and that really irritates them in a big way.
Exactly. And I think in a concrete example, we work with the Thai Anti-Money Laundering Organization, which is the financial intelligence unit of this country. working on civil law largely, as Matt mentioned, and they can open up a parallel case as long as there is an indicator that there might be human trafficking. It's a predicate offense. And we're also working with the parliaments of this country and all throughout ASEAN through the Inter-Parliamentary Assembly to push the idea of restitution funds so that these do exist under certain crimes, but if the idea is that if a human trafficker's assets are seized, they should not all go back to the state. There should be a percentage portioned off for a victim restitution fund. And those are hugely successful. It incentivizes victims to cooperate with law enforcement, and basically you're also creating the deterrent that you said is missing. Sorry, Ben, did you have a follow-up? Cool, okay.
In the World Cup, they paid restitution.
Yeah, do we have any other question? Fern, any other? Okay. Yeah, the picture of success I was pointing to before, Matt knows about this one too, is some years ago there was an operation called Operation World Cup. And long story short, there were victims from northern Thailand and Vietnam that ended up in forced sex trafficking situation down in Malaysia. And anyway, the victims got information out through open source ways, and that information was used to help get one of the victims out. And then eventually the trafficker, knowing that he sometimes came to Thailand, he had a girlfriend here, would also recruit. He was recruiting through Facebook and other things. He came and they tracked him, nabbed him, took him to court. Two good things happened here that made it a model case. First, the original victim who provided the information never had to meet her former trafficker. She also did not have to give an interview to 5 different agencies and have to go through this, horrific experience of retelling her story. Somebody was able to stand in as her witness and verify that that was her story. So handling the victim was really important. And then once the accused stood and he lost, it was a good prosecution, he had to pay out to her and to all the other victims as well, quite a bit of money. So we'd like to see more of that. Restitution, good victim-centric handling.
I'd like to give a story as well. The thing is, though, the big picture is quite bleak, but there are amazing organizations doing amazing, very, very clever, very effective things. The only problem is it's just not having a big impact. But I was involved in a program in Mongolia, and what happened was in the newspaper there would be these ads that say, if you are between the age of 17 and 21, beautiful, unmarried, you want to make money working in a restaurant in Japan, call us up. And there were a lot of these ads, and so the girls would call up. They would eventually go through the process. They'd be sent to Japan. For 2 weeks they'd work in a restaurant, and then on a false pretense they'd be sent to Macau, forced into prostitution. They'd end up doing that for a couple of years, and then when they went home, they didn't tell anyone, because if you're a good Mongolian girl and you have been in prostitution, you're not going to get a husband, you're going to bring shame to your family. So we knew what was happening, they knew what was happening. How do you stop it? So one of the organizations we worked with got a phone, put a bunch of minutes on it, hired an NGO person who never said who they were or where they were, and then we put an ad in the paper next to all those other ads that just simply said, before you contact anyone else, contact us. Down. So it demonstrates that you can come up with a very creative, cost-effective way to be able to address an issue using technology, using some common sense and practicality to kind of just clever the trafficking people, with coming up something that is able to counter what it is that they're doing.
interrupt at us any point. We got lots of stories. I mean, it just reminds me that, you know, the one problem I also see in part of the law enforcement community in some of the countries in this region, but generally, is the lack of sympathy also for certain kinds of victims, well, they knew what they were getting into type of syndrome. We did work with the Russian law enforcement authorities years ago, and a few other countries were blessed and supported to set up a front company that where we posed as a modeling agency and were recruiting. And so we came into contact with traffickers who were acting as middlemen, and certainly there were women from the Ukraine, Belarus, US, Russia, trying to go to Japan, to the US and other places. And, you know, for the most part, most of them were sold on the idea that they were going to be models. Yes, they might be working in certain clubs. Yes, they might have to work with certain clients. And then even some, it was put in plain English, although one wondered if they could read all the English, that they had to service 4 customers a day. Once into those countries and having to work at these places, not only did they have to service at least 4 customers a day, but they weren't able to keep their money. That's still a victim of human trafficking, no matter what their intention was when they took off. And, you know, we need to recognize that. The same goes for guys jumping on fishing boats from Cambodia or from Myanmar, et cetera. Like I said before, they might be entering an illegal immigration chain, helping to cheat the system because they're desperate for work. And, I mean, those stories, I think, the others pale in comparison to the ones we've heard about, the fishing boats, where people just get stuck on there for a long damn time. And don't end up with any money. A couple years ago, some of you might have heard, there was a victim, a Thai guy who had been out there for, I can't remember how many years, and the stories he told were just amazing. So, but we could go on and on with that, and I think, please interrupt at any point if you got Paul. We've got Paul here, who also used to work, Paul Buckley, used to work at the UN Interagency Project on Human Trafficking. And Paul, tell us where you're at now, and let's hear your question.
Hi, Steve. Great to see you again. And good to see you too, Matt. You're all around us here. Great to see you putting out this report. Always needs more attention. I'd like to pose a bit of a challenging question, given your work with the private sector now. And the thinking around coming together around a common plan is absolutely necessary, as you say. But how do you do that with the private sector? How do you think? Because different NGOs, different organizations have different strategies, of course, right? As you note, some take the approach of naming and shaming. You take the approach of partnering. Do you see those different approaches coming together? And just to contextualize that as well, if we look at, say, the business and human rights framework, right? The principles, the rugged principles from 2011, the business sector is saying, you know, well, now that we have these principles, voluntary really approached by corporations, that's what we should stick with. But there's a much stronger call now for mandatory due diligence, right? And within the UN and the EU, we're likely to see a really strong push for that over the next year or two. Do you think that your private sector partners would be keen on that? You know, being held to account for ensuring there's no slavery in their supply chains, human trafficking in their supply chains, and where would the Mekong Club kind of ride on that? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Great to see you. Paul and I worked together for years. I lived in Thailand for a long time myself. You know, when I first started the Mekong Club, much of what we did was basically try to get in front of companies to convince them that they needed to do something to address modern slavery. It was quite slow, and we didn't really have much intake or uptake. Then things changed. Legislation, the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australian Act, basically said if you're a big company, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery so that people can look to see what you're doing. Then we were seeing a significant increase in lawsuits against companies. And these lawsuits get a lot of public scrutiny, a lot of naming and shaming potential, and it creates a lot of problems for companies. We were seeing a significant increase in media coverage for the last 5 years, almost a doubling every year. we were seeing that there were certain NGOs that just specialized in identifying, picking certain companies, going after them, and just basically smearing them. And lastly, ESG, the kind of metric that's used to measure the do-gooderness of a company, became an issue because teachers in Canada were asking, how do I know that my investments aren't supporting modern slavery? And so as a result of this, all of a sudden the private sector came to realize that they have to do something to address this. And so we get tremendous receptivity from the private sector. They are very interested in identifying how to understand where human trafficking is, how to identify and how to address it in a way that prevents them from basically being kind of put in a newspaper article like what we saw with a recent organization, I'm not going to mention them, in the UK, who were accused of modern slavery, and it became a big issue and a big problem for them. You know, they don't really have to be pushed into it or cajoled into it. They're coming to us. And on any given day, we have consultations with the brands. They say we have this particular issue, this particular problem, and we really need to address it. When it comes to the question of what to do, whether you name and shame or whether you work with them, it's kind of a symbiotic relationship in that basically if there weren't naming and shaming organizations to kind of hold companies accountable, then my business wouldn't run. So I point at kind of these organizations and say, you don't want to be in that situation. Let's sit down, let's figure out what needs to be done, and let's fix it. And that usually is enough to get companies to step up. And a certain number of companies do one other thing that's quite interesting, which is they become leaders. They internalize the fact that, wow, this is really a terrible thing. We put all the systems and procedures in place, and now basically we feel like we want to go out there and tell the world that we really think that this needs to stop. And they take a very proactive approach.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Matt. Do we have another question? Is that Karen?
Hi. Hi, Matt. I'm Karen Emmons, independent journalist. I have lots of questions, but I don't have them articulated because I've been following this for 20 years, and in so many ways, a lot hasn't changed. I mean, there's a lot being done, but as you know, I've been following all the training that's been done over the past 20 years of police, of border people, of this and that. And then yet you sit here and you talk about it's really hard to deter it because the police and these people who supposedly have been trained are desperate themselves or on the take or part of the organizers, da-di-da-di-da. So where's it been falling apart? What are the cracks? What's falling in the cracks? That's one sort of question, inarticulated, I know. Another one is, in the last few years, we have seen a lot of stuff going after fishermen, and there's been a lot there's been some prosecutions, not a lot, but there's been a lot of tension on trafficking in the seas. Has that had any real dent? What do you see happening with the trafficking of people onto fishing boats? And another question, if you don't mind. How is forced labor changing? What are the manifestations of forced labor? Because there used to be so much, factories could get away with so much. But then there's been so much attention over the last 10 years of raids and going into factories and a lot of private sector involvement. And a lot of now the public is demanding to know that their products are not made from slavery. So what are the forced labor types these days? Has it changed much in the last 10 or 20 years? What's new about it, I guess? Thanks.
Okay, you know, in every country there's going to be a certain number of cops that are not so good, and certain number that are really good, and a lot somewhere in between. And every country in the world I've been in, and even the countries people say that none of the cops are good, you have people that you can work with. The fact that our prosecutions and arrests are at such a low level, there's a fair amount of low-hanging fruit that we should be able to kind of pick through this process that would result in us doing better than the number of convictions and legal things that we're constrained with. And so, I think part of the problem is that you have a lot of different organizations doing a lot of things, as opposed to us coming together as a community and making sure that we cover all of the bases and that we have the shelters covered and we have the kind of the psychosocial covered and we have the legal response covered and we have all of those things. That's why a plan is needed, because it would allow us to see where the gaps are and what needs to be done in order to address it. The fishing industry in Thailand has been kind of a major talking point for a long time. I'm sure that there are things that have improved in Thailand. I'm not there now, so I can't respond, but I want to bring up another issue. It's not just fishing in Thailand that we have to be concerned about, it's fishing all over the world. There seems to be a spotlight that's just focusing on Thailand, but if you look at fleets all over the world, in Indonesia, in Japan, Korea, South America, Africa, North America, you find that similar types of abuses, because people don't want to get on fishing boats because it's an awful type of job. And the pay is really low and it's hard work. And so you often have to kind of traffic people onto things. When it comes to forced labor, the categories are pretty much the same as they were for the last 20 years. As I indicated, we're adding new categories to this when people feel like they can get away with a particular type of crime. We have to prioritize. Where do we think that we're going to have a significant win? My concern is that there will eventually be donor fatigue. If we're not able to demonstrate more impact, more criminals being put in jail, more money being stopped, then the donors will say, well, maybe we should just go to this other sector, we'll get more bang for the buck. So that's the reason why it's extremely important to have good data, intelligence, analysis, a collective response, follow through. All of those things are essential for us to be able to make a difference that's impactful and measurable.
Thank you, Matt. And just to point out for Karen and others who've answered your questions, so we've produced, to the point you've made, we've produced a few other studies, which if you put these pieces of the puzzle together, we've done one on counter-wildlife trafficking, what's been tried to stop it, what's worked, what hasn't. We've done this one on human trafficking. We've also done one on the convergence of trafficking, human, wildlife, narcotics, et cetera, and how we can converge enforcement. And some of the lessons learned have been, in addition to making it a more punishing environment for the bad people, we need to make it a more rewarding environment for the good people. And it's a pretty, we've got a very disparate counter-trafficking community. And I think there are ways, like we talked about with the restitution, to incentivize collaboration, to incentivize the sharing of data. Matt's right. Most of the organizations, unless you are part of a joint grant or contract, you don't have time for the others. You might have lunch or whatever, but there's not a whole lot of sharing of data. That's one of the reasons we set up this data fusion center. And we're also developing blockchain-based tokens to track the sharing of data so that once it's used for an impactful way, we can trace back to who helped us and we can all share in the rewards. Of course, the idea would be to push as much of that into recovery funds. One thing we've also come to conclude is the need for multi-agency enforcement networks that, especially when it comes to human trafficking, also include civil society organizations and increasingly corporate representatives. We call them TENs. You can call them whatever you want, but Trafficking Enforcement Network. And then to link up focal points across borders. And in addition to the usual police, customs, FIUs, et cetera, it's very important, at least especially in this region, to include marine security, MARSEC. And there's some amazing work being done by different agencies in this region that we know about to intercept everything from illicit, tobacco trafficking to everything else. And they come across an incredible amount of data because they've got these satellites and boats out there. And they're not always guided to be looking for indicators of human trafficking. So the good news is the technology and the infrastructure's there. We need the common plan, and we need to incentivize success. So, We're pretty much running out of time here, but if we got time for more questions, and we can also talk to you afterwards if you want. So, Matt, I want to thank you for joining us tonight from Hong Kong and sharing your incredible wealth of experience. And it was great working with you on this report. And we're going to get it out to as many people as we can and agencies. And we look forward to more collaboration. And we thank everybody for joining us here at the FCC tonight and through the Facebook Live. This is recorded, so for those who couldn't see it tonight or you want to share it with somebody, it'll be put on YouTube later. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Let's hit the bar.